Excellent. Thank you, everybody. Nice to see so many faces. We've got an interesting call today. It's one of the things that we didn't cover actually in detail last year was with the fact that with the pandemic and everything else that, all of a sudden people's employees were remotely working, they were distributed all around the country. And essentially it came down to things like, how do we manage devices? How do they get updates? How do we connect to office systems? Lee and Chris were on a little bit earlier this year talking about data center connectivity and how you can lift and shift things from being on premise and inside offices into the cloud essentially. And then how do you get connections to those? Had a tour around DCI recently, which was awesome. It was great to see some of the technology there. Certainly from my side, being a bit of a geek in that department. So today we've got sort of a spread of technologies. We've got the data center side of things, which Lee and Chris are going to cover. We've got the networking side of things, which Max is going to cover because home broadband can be a challenge for people, especially if you live in rural areas. And then we've got Spencer from VMware on the line today as well, really to talk about how do we manage devices. So how do we keep devices up to date? How do we manage security? How do we push out applications? So essentially what we tried to do here is map from this all the way to the data center and making sure that you're taking advantage of available technology so that all of this can come together, which means that now you can start to think about a work from anywhere strategy for your business, but also protect the data inside your company as well so that it doesn't leak off these devices. Sound good? Awesome. So this is a fireside chat. So from your perspective, feel free to chime in if you've got any questions. If there's something you want to deep dive, make sure you get those questions so that you can go away with a bit of a plan around what to do next. And with that, I'm going to hand over to you, Mr. Pitts, to talk a little bit about the end user devices and what you saw last year as part of VMware.
Yep, thanks, Ollie, and thanks everybody that's on the call. Hopefully you'll find this bit interesting. But so one of the things Ollie and I were talking, sorry, I'm calling him Ollie, I should call him Oliver, but we've known each other from a previous life. But yeah, so last year, I guess, lockdown time, March time, just afterwards, we saw a massive influx of requests because people were trying to basically take most of their workforce and relocate them at home. Although the only thing I would say to that is depends on the industry as well. So we tend to focus a lot for the people that work from home, but most of the time they're a particular type of user, sort of office worker that we took from the office and put them at home. We also saw a lot of other stuff around, people that were in shops that suddenly become drivers overnight as well. So we sometimes forget about that piece as well, where everyone focuses on the working from home because it's the big thing that was a massive shift. But at the same time, there were other use cases where people change roles overnight. Just something to sort of flag into it as well, Ollie. But yeah, I guess in the first, 2-3 weeks, and we coined the phrase at VMware, we called it the response phase. Everybody just did what they did to get everybody up and running, right? So I had stories of people taking monitors home, physical machines because they had nothing at home, or you go out and buy a new machine. People went down to the local, I won't say the name of them, but you probably know which one I mean, that you normally go in there and have a look and then probably end up buying somewhere else. The showroom, as I sometimes call it now, but they went and got a load of machines from wherever they could to ship them out to everybody just to get people up and running. But what tended to happen is when they did that, and I'm not sure if everybody saw this as well, is they probably did it to try and keep people up and running, but they maybe even neglected a bit of the security. And they probably didn't have the best experience because it was a kind of a case of, well, we just got to do what we got to do. So there was that initial rush, Ollie, that I saw, that response. And then as things quietened down a little bit, it depends how mature you are as a company, because some people were more suited to remote working, flexible working, or as we now call the anywhere workspace. Some people were more sort of, you know what, I'd never let any of my workers ever go anywhere outside the office. They have to come to the office 9 till 5. And if they're not in their desk, we don't know what they're up to. So therefore they clearly aren't working. So you had different ends of the spectrum from companies, right? But the technology has always been there, but some of it was also a bit of culture of the company themselves, maybe some of the management as well. And you know what, not their fault. They just didn't know any other way of doing it. It's just, that's the way it was, right? But then as things started to settle down, we saw a lot of people go back and have a look at things and go, all right, okay, well, maybe we need to increase our VPN technology. And I know Max is going to talk about another way of doing that better, shall we say. But, a lot of people had VPNs. That's how they did stuff, right? And we've kind of been using it. I now call VPNs virtually pointless now, by the way. That's my little acronym for them. But depends where you are as a company and what your application estate was. But yeah, people went back and started doing things a bit different. Things like service desks. Think about that now. You used to be in the office, you go down to your IT support desk, ask John or Sarah, whoever they are, that, can you help me out with my laptop? Think about all of that stuff as well. So we saw a massive increase on how you do things like self-service as well. And security, you started getting attacks increase because people now were using devices. And the key thing there was, well, actually, it's easy to manage a device. I say it's easy. Some people couldn't do it before as well, but it's a lot easier to manage a device when it was in one place, as opposed to that machine now being at the end of a piece of string. Again, Max will tell you how you can do that a bit better later on, but kind of in somebody's house. And then the big one there is PCs, like Windows PCs, and traditional tooling just wasn't set up to look after them when they're remote. However, as you know, Ollie, in our previous life when we were managing phones, we've always been able to manage phones over the air. So there was this big shift that we saw last year where people really looking into what they call modern management to try and make sure that you can look after every device wherever it is, right? Because you need to make sure it's patched, got all the security stuff that's required. And so you can find out what's going on. Because if you don't know what's going on with your machine, then you could be open to problems. Users can have bad experience. And then what we're finally seeing at the moment that I'm talking to a lot of customers around is, what do you do if you had a blank piece of paper and forget what you used to do before? And then with all the learnings of what happened with lockdown, how would you design a proper environment to get people working anywhere? You wouldn't say, I'll tell you what, I'm going to route all my traffic back to a data center in the middle of HQ and have all my apps there to go out to go and consume Office 365 or something, right? You go, actually, I want to do it properly and, look after the devices wherever they are. Think about how our workers get onboarded. So there's a lot of things there around now that we're doing a lot of work with customers around thinking about this future work. And then very lastly, we're now calling it, like I said, anywhere workspace, but think of it more as a hybrid model. Because at some point, maybe we might be allowed to go back to the office. And then you're starting to get into this dynamic now where people are thinking, is it 2 days in the office, 3 days in the office for some users? And then that draws interesting problem statements, because you now need to make sure that my experience at home is either as good as, or in some cases better, or maybe the office needs to be better. Because if you have a really good experience at home, you might kind of go back to the office for a bit to say hello to your mates you haven't seen for about 16 months. But then once that all settles down, you're very used to working at home, you might probably want to do most of your work at home. So that whole role of the office and how do we keep the experience the same, I think is also important. And we're starting to see a lot of people talking about that. That's a long-winded probably response to you there, Ollie, but it gives you a flavour of what we saw, what people are doing now still, and how we see things going forward as well.
Yeah, and it was sort of important because the thing is these devices are very agile, like you say, and you need to push out new applications for your workforce to be able to consume. Maybe it's the fact that some of the technology, you get rid of a VPN and you've got to push out configuration to use a different identity system. So there's very transient bits to this. So the whole environment has to be very agile, but that agility times location suddenly becomes really, really challenging again. So, when it's and Rupert, you keep me honest here because you probably know this better than the most of us on this call, which is, if you're all inside an office, logistically patching and making sure everything's up to date and running, the latest security vulnerabilities, removed the right software, that in itself is a challenge, isn't it? So push your workforce out to work from home, and you've just magnified the challenge using a lot of traditional management. I'm
here for the free coffee, not part of the panel. So apologies for the overly aggressive default background wallpaper I've got. But yeah, to echo what Spence said, it's VPNs are a pain. They're a sort of necessary evil to get users at distance connected to big legacy on-premises applications that just don't travel particularly well. Our customer base ranges from 2 to 500 users, and these big well, quite frankly, big bastard applications, Sage 200, Orderwise, SAP, they lurk around and they just absorb infrastructure, and you've got to get the data to the user somehow. And for those that are allergic or can't lift and shift to Azure or AWS or wherever they want to go, you got to run a VPN, and that requires infrastructure, and it's just a pain. But these big legacy systems are legacy typically for a reason, because they're pretty good and they're really difficult to swap out. And if you've got a really good legacy system that's working well for the business and the, so on and so forth, it's difficult. So yeah, it's be good to see them all shot in the paddock, but it's not going to happen. These big systems are going to be around forever.
Yeah, and on that basis, I mean, Max, this is something you and I have spoken about a fair few times as well, which is, home broadband isn't all it's cracked up to be. A lot of the numbers and figures that you get from the suppliers are not typically the actual numbers and figures you get from the suppliers. And again, we've spoken in previous calls about if somebody's rural in a property and they've got poor internet connectivity, how can they work in a hybrid world? And this is something that I know you guys have been looking at in a lot of detail over the last 12 months with all sorts of different businesses, not just home working, but also large corporates that just didn't have enough inbound capability either, right?
Yeah, it's been a very interesting conversation to be part of. I'll go into a bit more detail later on, but we had a customer of ours who wanted to shift to work from anywhere. And for anybody who wasn't able to work from home because of poor connectivity, it was basically going to be a case of they didn't have a job anymore. And this was a very big, well-known brand, by the way. This wasn't a small, dodgy company. So that need for better connectivity everywhere is obviously something that's becoming more and more important. And you're right, depending on, even not just rural, depending where you are in the world, you might have great connectivity or really poor. And work from anywhere, work from home might seem like a perk, but actually it's just a nightmare. It's almost not worth the hassle a lot of the time.
Yeah, and there are solutions out there that allow you to do things like aggregate multiple broadband connections. So essentially, if you're in a world where kids come home from school and fire up Netflix and YouTube and Roblox and those sort of things, and all of a sudden your bandwidth plummets and your Zoom or team calls start breaking up, there are solutions to that. And that's certainly some of the tech that you guys were rolling out last year as well, right? To help home workers kind of get a better experience. Okay, there's a bit of cost, but.
Yeah, so that's one of the things. So going back a decade when we started, essentially what we've been doing for the last 10 years, 12 years or so, is using software to make connectivity a bit better. So we released a device about this big, this is going back a decade, called an EVX, which is still the same name we use today. They did that, just that. It allowed you to aggregate multiple broadband connections together, so you could have the bandwidth of both. Allowed to have quality of service, so you can prioritize and deprioritize business critical applications. So if you're running a call like this or a voice call, if you've got a VPN that you want protecting against the kids using the connection, or your other half is also working, then basically we built a device that did that. Now, the problem that we found quite early on is it doesn't matter how clever that piece of kit is. If you're running it over a broadband connection, which is heavily contended, costs £10–15 a month, it doesn't really matter how clever that piece of software is if that underlying connectivity can't support it. So that was a realization we made about 10 years ago. So what we started developing was, as well as that software and that device getting better, we built a core network. So we've built out what we call our intelligent network fabric. And this is basically an ecosystem which sits on top of every major ISP in the UK. We've got 6 data centers. We've got interconnects with every major cloud provider. So to Rupert's comment about VPNs being awful and having to route traffic into the corporate network, essentially we built up that corporate network as part of our own so that we can manage the VPN connectivity and that access to cloud providers for our customers. But also we've built up what we call our multi-ISP transport layer. And basically what that means is we can deliver carrier independent connectivity. Because all our ISPs are a bit naff, BT might be great for you in your house, but in your neighbor's house, it might be awful. and the same for TalkTalk, Virgin, PlusNet, whoever you work with. They're going to be bad at different periods of time. And there's no real getting around that. And we wanted to work with an ISP, but we didn't want to be stuck with just a single one. And it's become quite a common theme now with more of our customers. So when we deliver an interconnection now, we're not limiting it to just a single provider. So right now I've got an interconnection into my house, which is through Zen today. Next week it might be TalkTalk, and the week after it might be BT. And essentially what's happening with the way that we deliver a connection is that it's just on a loop of changing ISPs depending on who's managing their network in the best way. So you're not suddenly limiting yourself to just one and the best of the bad bunch. Essentially, we're chopping, changing things behind the scene to get a level of performance, essentially.
Nice. And I mean, the connectivity side of things, one of the things that we're looking at as a business at the moment is a use case for developers. So for anybody that doesn't know, VDI is a technology, virtual desktop. Was 2020 the year of VDI, Spence?
Yeah, so was 2019 and 2018. No, but in all seriousness, so I started working with VDI in 2007, believe it or not.
On that basis, though, let's just level set. So VDI is the ability for you to have a desktop in the cloud. So from your perspective, you can get to it from any machine. So I can log in from my home machine, but I've got my corporate world in a browser, essentially. But yeah, sorry, Spence.
No, it's fine. So it doesn't necessarily just have to be in the cloud. The main thing is you can connect to a virtual machine, but it could be a physical machine as well. So to that point, last year I talked about in that response phase, we had a lot of people that were massively increasing their VDI estates. If you already had VDI, a lot of people just increased it. We had a great example of a customer in the US who went from nothing at all, no remote work, nobody was allowed to leave the office. And then they stood up their VDI, I think over a weekend, 48 hours roughly, 7,500 people, and got them up and running. They didn't even have a DMZ as you and I would know it, like a kind of a security tooling, because they didn't really have people coming in remotely as such. Everything was pretty much outside. So we stood that up as part of it. And people were connecting in, and we've now got about 37,500 people all using virtual desktop. That's how they got up and running. And I think it was Rupert's point there. So that's how they access all those legacy old apps that we haven't taken out to the paddock yet, right? Yeah, that's what they did. And let's be honest, that's a great use case for a lot of customers. Nobody had time to go, you know what, I'm going to redevelop every single application. And they're all going to be lovely and they're all going to work in the cloud. But you do get some customers that were born in the cloud and don't have that legacy on-prem. But to Rupert's point, if you've been in business for any length of time, you're going to have all these weird and wonderful apps that breathe on them and they might break, so don't touch them. You know what I mean? Those ones, they're sitting in the corner. They do something. We kind of know what they do, but and the guy that wrote it's not here anymore.
We have had the situation where the guy who wrote it's died. And that's like the apex of stress on every single front you can possibly imagine. And it's Fox Pro is what it was written in. Sweet mercy, try untangling that nest. Hard-coded IP addresses, the whole lot. Anyway, it was
you get my point, right? Anyway, so yeah, VDI has been a savior for those guys. But that's my point is, it's a great way of getting people up and running right now and going forward. And even things like, think about developers, like you said, right? And a lot of that code that you want to kind of protect, keep inside the corporate bounds, if you like, but you still need people to do it remotely. So how do you do that? So that's a great use case that a lot of people use for developers as well. But anyway, there's lots of other ones, but yeah.
But on that basis, and this is where VDI becomes more attractive. So again, if you've got your desktop, your Windows machine in the cloud, you log into it through a web browser, you get the same experience as though you're sat in front of it. But you can then ring fence it so the data can't leak out. So if an employee loses their laptop, your data is still safe. As a business owner, all of a sudden you start to think about, you've got the agility to work from anywhere. Lee, to some of the conversations that we've had, they've been, VDI is accessible to small businesses, right? There's an opportunity for them to basically say, well, I've only got 10 employees. Well, actually, you could use VDI to solve a lot of those challenges. And that's where the data center comes in to make sure they can connect from anywhere in the world.
Yes, so that's sort of providing the infrastructure, the cloud infrastructure to put your desktops on, but there's also an element of the applications that were on premise and moving them to a cloud. So we saw a number of people doing the digital transformation and thinking about becoming a cloud first type business. So when you have your desktop and your applications within the same infrastructure with some really good connectivity to it, then the experience is exactly the same as if you was in the office. But then you get that dynamic base coming on, which does allow you to kind of work from any location really. So going forward, you are protecting the business, as it were, on that side.
Yeah, and I'm smiling because back to Rupert's point, just because you can lift and shift Sage Line 50 to a data center doesn't make it a cloud first citizen, but at least it gets you halfway there in terms of being able to access that data from anywhere in the world without, VPNs and various other pieces. What would you say was the split right now from a DCI's perspective? Would you say that you're mobilizing the applications more than providing desktops? Is that where you guys are finding more of a sweet spot for most customers?
I think it's a mix because people are concerned about a number of things really. One is if their applications servers are in the office and it's maybe connected by a 100 meg gig line, then if that fails, then the whole workforce moves down. So moving the application servers into the same infrastructure helps protect that, as well as sort of concerns around where the data resides, the data security, and the speed of that. So, they don't want their staff wandering off with the data or maybe putting it onto the locations they shouldn't. And again, just making sure that they get the best experience so that they're not demoralized in their job, what they're doing, so they are actually getting on and doing it. And the IT is not a hindrance to them. So, it's a level sort of playing field of trying to bring that up. And some of the applications, aren't really designed for a cloud type solution. So, you have to kind of find a workaround. And I think what we found is that where people are talking to us, particularly because going to the big hypervisors, AWS, Azure, you're not really going to get that sort of assistance in there. You now need to go and speak to another third party to bring this level of conversations in. But we've where we run our own data center, we've been able to help and provide like a hybrid solution, so we can actually do a physical shift of the server, put that into the data center, but also connect it to the cloud as well. So there is a number of solutions that can be had trying to do that, as well as ongoing migration solutions just to secure the business.
Yeah, and when those applications have been shifted to cloud, the next stage for that is to start to think about how you can make them cloud native. And cloud native is, Microsoft 365 is cloud native as an example, right? You buy it, you pay for it through the cloud, and you consume it. I think the problem is there are so many legacy systems that will not be cloud ready, that will require so much development effort to get them to be cloud ready, that ultimately the data center and is the only and the best place for them. But the other piece to that puzzle is you're taking all those hardware costs off the table. You're taking off I need to refresh this every 3 years and someone's got to maintain it and secure it and all the other pieces. So you're kind of taking away a lot of the pain associated with just the management of those apps as well, right?
Yeah, and that's one of the bits with it, because again, you may have someone that's got a server that maybe still got 12 months worth of lifespan in it, and we could move that to the data center. But then after coming to that end of the period, with the end of life maybe on the hardware, rather than going out and purchasing new hardware, then we can look at a migration to put that application fully into a cloud. So then you're not having to reinvest into the hardware, you're then going to fully cloud native. And then if the application changes and grows, then that ebbs and flows with the cloud infrastructure underneath. So it's a far more sort of neater proposition going forward, trying to work that together.
Yeah, and removing those sort of CapEx costs off of organizations and more OpEx. Right, without wishing to get into a GPO fight with Rupert on this particular topic, you'll know where I'm going with this in a second. About three years ago, nearly 4 years ago, the technology that VMware has for managing Windows devices remotely gave us parity with on-premise systems that do that, like SCCM as an example, where you could push out patches, upgrades, new applications to your employees remotely, irrespective of where they were, as long as they had, reasonable bandwidth for those apps to be installed. Spence, from your side, there's that tipping point, isn't there, between the traditional kind of management systems that have been around since, I'm trying to remember, when did SCCM, was that 2006? It was SMS before that, right, from my memory. So the outcome of that is, businesses are now starting to look at, how do I manage Windows type machines remotely without having to have people come into the office and have them kind of patched and updated by engineers, right?
Yeah. So as I said, in that response phase, people just did what they did. But then they realized after about 3 months that SCCM, for those that still haven't updated it, right? They weren't checking in. And there's some things you can do. So let's be honest, there's some cloud bridging type technologies you can do, but a lot of people don't want to do that, or they're adverse to it, or they haven't been able to do it for whatever reason. Regulatory could be another reason as well, right? Not everybody's open to sticking that piece to allow it open. But so a lot of people just had VPNs, and when it's on the VPN, but the problem there, which kind of goes back to Max's point, is do you really want all your bandwidth consumed for updating packages when people are trying to do business calls? Or call center workers that are suddenly working from home and they need to get the job done, and suddenly all their bandwidth's being consumed because you're trying to push down Acrobat Reader 71 billion.x or whatever it is, because it updates every time I wake up. It feels like it anyway. You know what I mean? So those kind of things. So, and a lot of people are still using it because that's the way you architected it, and you had to come in through the corporate network. So the big change has always been is that, and that's what we've been doing at VMware for ages, is you shouldn't really we should be able to update your machine wherever you are, anywhere, hence the anywhere, right? So it doesn't matter if it's over the internet or not, or through the lovely that SD-WAN type technology that we're talking about just a moment ago. It doesn't really matter. It should be able to be updated anyway, because that's what we've done with phones. You think about it, you don't wake up in the morning on a Windows PC and go, I wonder what updates I've done, and I'll just click on the latest iOS update like we all do. Trying to do that on a corporate environment, it's like, no, you're not allowed to do it. And IT spend their whole life trying to stop people from doing anything that changes it, right? But that's not what we're used to on the phone. And I think what's happened now, everyone's really realized that they need to go to a model where they manage everything in the same way, all over the air, real time. And that's that concept of modern management. And even little things like, he says, because I've got one just happens to be sitting here, what happens when you onboard somebody, right? You used to go to the office, meet your manager. There you go. Right, thanks. Here's the team. Oh, and by the way, go to IT and they'll give you a machine. And they you unbox it and it's already there, and hopefully it's there. Some people don't get it for a long time. The new model, of course, is you need to be able to get this and deliver it directly to the door. So when you do that, then you've got to think, well, how do I update it? How do I get it installed? So there's a load of things that you can do now. And this is the thing. Technology isn't really the blocker anymore. It's you need to evolve the processes. I know one story of I'm going to say who it is, but a large financial institution where they physically had to go in to get a two-factor fob. And that had to be signed by the manager, and there was a whole sort of manual process around it. So they couldn't kick off the bill for the machine until somebody had done something, right? And it involved you physically going to the office. Well, guess what? That didn't kind of work last year. So there's some things there that you need to think about. And a lot of it is just that's the way they've always done it. It's just, we're creatures of habit, and IT spend their whole life trying to make everything really simple and one tool to rule, as I always used to call it, right? So, but anyway, things have changed, and we need a different way of thinking about it.
Yeah, it was definitely liberating when you just get shipped a vanilla machine, you wake it up, connect it to your Wi-Fi, walk away for 3 or 4 hours and come back, and it's completely personalized itself to you. That was, that's a big shift, because that means that IT don't have to stage an image and get machines ready. And all of that happened over the air, which was great. There was going back to your point about two-factor authentication, there was a business that I did some work for several years ago where essentially everybody had a password, AD password, to log into their machine, right? Somebody's password had expired while they were on holiday. They came back on the day that their manager had gone on holiday, and their manager was the only person that could approve their password reset. So for 2 weeks, they had zero access to any corporate systems, literally zero access. And there was no way that they could circumnavigate that. Their manager, unfortunately, was uncontactable. So they spent 2 weeks with zero productivity. They're the kind of archaic solutions that basically don't work in today's world because everything is so mobile, it's so kind of transient. Has anybody on the call at the moment, tried to manage device remotely or had issues with employees not being able to connect to systems over the last 12 months? Going to give it the 5-second Zoom rule. You taught me that, Spence. Rupert, from your side, you've probably got 17 horror stories at least of exactly that, right?
At least. Yeah, it's so for those that don't know, we do IT support for small businesses, Microsoft specialist and all that stuff. And yeah, we've had all sorts of scenarios. I mean, one thing that we found, the most notable thing we found when lockdown happened was it put an immediate fracture into our client base. Those that were immediately able to just go off and do what they needed to do, and those that weren't. And those that had underinvested in their IT infrastructure and had slow office internet connections and big legacy databases, and you can throw all the VPN remote working you like at it, but when the office has got a 5 meg connection and everyone's used to having a desktop, you see Max laughing, used to having a desktop with a gigabit connection straight to the database server, and they're in the middle of nowhere and slow internet is just something they've just come to live with, suddenly you can't just send everybody home because it's just not the bandwidth. So other organizations like the chamber actually were pretty much perfectly set up to deal with this. Not quite in the Spencer-esque world of VDI and all of that stuff, but they had a very, very big internet connection, lots of, provision for remote desktop servers, lots, all nicely set up and ready to go. And that meant they could just go home and start working. So yeah, it did put an immediate sort of haves and have-nots. And then the 3 months after that was spent leveling up and trying to get laptops out to people who had insisted that desktops were the way to go and all of that stuff. So yeah, it's yeah, it did put into stark relief in this time last year who had invested in their IT and who had that agility and who could react, and those that couldn't. Yeah.
It was quite a common theme for us that we were getting more and more people come to us saying, IT support people, whether that be for a service provider or just an internal team, who have just sent their staff home and have realized they've got no idea how to actually provide technical support. Then the difference is if you've got 10, 20 people, 100 people sat in an office and the broadband goes down, well, you know what to do because you walk over and you can see what's happening with your firewall, your router, you know how to fix things. If someone's having an issue with their phone, you can just walk over to the desk and work out how to fix it. Pardon?
Plug it in.
Yeah. We had one of the big supermarket chains actually come into our lab in Peterborough, actually, which is open for anybody to visit. And they just sent 300 odd contact center staff home. And the nightmare they were having is that they just had no idea. Sometimes people would phone up and say they can't work that day because their broadband's down. They just had to take their word for it. They had no idea. Other people weren't able to make calls, and they're not sure whether it's a problem with they have a very heavily contended connection at home. Is it a phone problem? Is it an internet connection?
Well, we went from supporting 2,000 people, 3,000 people at 100 offices to supporting 3,000 people at 3,000 offices. And CTM doesn't do B2C. We don't provide IT support for like people, just businesses. And suddenly we were finding that, our engineers go on and do something and then Netflix stops working. So, okay, all right. And you get home and you've got IP conflicts because they're on 192.168.0, as is the office, good one. And so they can't get on the VPN. So we have to reconfigure that. And then suddenly the static IP address for their Sky Q box doesn't work. So, okay, so we're underwriting all this now, are we? And all those sorts of problems. So yeah, it did put a bit of a spotlight on it. And it's an interesting one in that I think if working from home is to become a permanent enforced thing as we go through lockdowns and sinusoidal wave as these things come and go at Christmas and the winter, if you can't work from home because you live in an area with poor broadband, or you can't work from home because you just you don't have a good internet connection, then maybe you just can't work for that business. And it's going to become akin to saying, well, I haven't got a car, so I can't drive into the office. Well, so you can't work for us then.
And this is where it's a very interesting conversation. It gets to the point of, well, is it then discriminating against people who live in a rural area? Can they just not have a certain type of job?
Yeah.
So yeah, it's one of those things that we got thrown this problem at us, and in fact, it became quite common. You know, we had banks approaching us and all sorts of approaches saying we need to send these staff home. We're going to work from anywhere now. So on one hand, they need a better connectivity solution at home, but also their tech guys need to be able to provide technical support to them. So essentially what they have now is a single dashboard that has every single home user connection just on a single screen. So if somebody goes offline, they've got visibility over it. If somebody's unable to make a call and says their broadband's offline, you can say, well, nope, I can see your connection now. So
that's a slippery slope though, because then you're like monitoring people's personal internet connections, and if they've got a problem, they should phone their ISP who have the same visibility.
well, this is it. This is where we can, and this, you're right, this is a whole
Just a nightmare. Sack them all. That's what I say.
Essentially take over somebody's home internet connection.
Yeah.
Everything's encrypted, encapsulated anyway, so neither the business or us can actually see the data that's passing over it. But what you can see from an IT support function is how is that connection behaving. So is latency really high? Is the connection up or down? Those kind of things. So less about looking into what the connection is doing and what data is passing over it. It's more just about providing proper technical support for your staff. The same way you have for an office of 1,000 people, you now can provide technical support to people who are dotted all over the country. You're right, though, and it kind of depends on the person. There's multiple different ways to look at it, at how you actually protect that business data. One of the things that a lot of our customers were looking at doing is basically having a personal connection at home and a business connection at home. And then you kind of separate traffic completely. Again, the problem, you then got people who are perhaps they're renting their house and they're not able to have two connections installed, or maybe just it's not feasible to have a personal and a business connection.
And why should the business bear that cost? Like, we don't pay for their cars to commute in.
Well, it depends on whether they want to shut down an office. So this business in particular, financial institution have moved to work from anywhere full time. So they now won't have any offices. So you're suddenly taking a big chunk of that money you were spending on desks, hundreds of pounds per person per month to be sat in an office. And you take, if it's £500 a month to sit in an office, take £200 of that and invest in internet connection and, you know, all these things that the guys are talking about today. And you just invest in a different way. And I think it's one of those things, if you want to shift to work from anywhere and do it properly and be able to provide proper technical support, have that work from, well, the office experience from home, the only way to really do that is by spending a bit of money, you know, really. It's just where you get that money from.
But I also think it's a, you know, for a lot of businesses, that's a sound investment, because as you just said, maybe you don't need such a big office because you've got a hybrid team coming in and out. There are all sorts of, unfortunately, there's like a one size fits all to this. You know, you talk to people in the legal profession or even in accountancy as well. There's a degree of, well, I need to print, you know, reams and reams of documents and those sort of things, which again means they don't need to have printers that are local to them that support that sort of throughput. So there are many different ways to this, but essentially, I think the one big takeaway from 2020 was that a hybrid workforce where you can go to an office if you want, but also you're flexible enough to provide home working should your employee be able to do that, right? That transformed the game. And the last stats that I read, you know, that really jumped forwards by nearly a decade. So if an employee needs to go and look after their child in the afternoon, for whatever reason, they're able to do it, but they can take their equipment home and still work effectively. They're the sort of strategies that businesses are trying to wrap their heads around at the moment, because to Spencer's point, they're not doing it in a responsive, oh my God, this needs to happen type way, but actually a more prescribed and planned approach so that it's got that, you know, enterprise grade to it, you know, that's supported. But you're still going to run into some of those challenges as to what Rupert was saying around the management of devices and when things conflict and BT ship you a new home hub that doesn't work and all these sort of things. From you know, from a management perspective, the fact that you can work anywhere now and that you can connect to these things, whether you're on holiday in an office or from home, means that actually the technology is there to take advantage of. And then to Spencer's and Lee's point, you know, it's around sitting down and being smart around what apps and services use to make that happen for your team. Lee, going back to your sort of point around the application side of things, it's not just the apps, it's the communication and it's the security into those data centers as well. And that, I know that plays into Max and also into Spence as well, around how you can make sure that that data is secure when it's in the cloud. What challenges did you see for organizations last year? Did they just default to VPNs and they're going to look at other technologies moving forwards? Or did businesses think smartly around, how they secure those apps and their data?
Well, I think there's been a number of things. One was the quick reaction was to kind of get some VPNs up and running, just to make sure that they, the first sort of 3 months, etc., things were running. But now we're having the conversations now of how do we actually make this better? How do we make it more secure? I mean, there is the pillars that you get, between security and speed of access. The more you move to security, the further you move away from speed and access. But what we're seeing now, and it's working with like Max and Spencer, so all the vendors are jointly aligned into what we're doing to achieve that. So we're looking at different layers of security from the networking, from the cloud gateways, through to the actual software that provides VDI and the application. So it's all sort of, a mixing pool of it as everything comes together to provide a solution, because all the end user wants to be able to do is to click onto a button and their desktop flies up and that's it, and it's all secure. But the business just needs to know that everything's safe and running. So it is moving to that sort of model, I think.
Yeah, and you touched on a really good point. This is my life, right? It's got my bank details on it, it's got my pictures on it, it's got everything on it, right? And essentially I can unlock it with my face. So if I can do that with my face, why can't I unlock my corporate grade laptop with my face and still have the right level of security to be able to consume those apps? That's the perception that people have, isn't it, today, that it should be that simple.
Yeah, it's trying to keep it simple, and there's new methodologies. It has been around for a while, but it's probably making more, which is zero trust on networking with applications, and all the different tiers of access to these solutions. And it's looking at data flows within the networking, looking for rogue information. I'm just trying to keep it nice and simple. But yeah, it needs an onion sort of approach to it to make the multiple layers there, but be able to identify who has access to it, and give them the needs to that as and when they want. And if they're not available, then everything is sort of locked off, really. So
yeah, 100%. We know somebody that likes zero trust, right, Spencer?
Yeah.
Spent about the last decade trying to convince the world that zero trust was the way forwards, and he's finally getting some credibility for that standpoint, right?
But you do raise a good point about that whole face thing, right? So the big thing that I think also people have struggled with is most people are saying lock down the device, right? But then some people didn't have devices to send out. So we saw a lot of people trying to use bring your own devices through the lockdown as well, because it was the only device they could use. And to that point, and what do you allow and what do you not allow? And it's that whole sort of separation between personal, like you said, you've got your life on your phone. So how do you separate the data out? But the key thing then is you need to be able to trust the person, right? So in the office, when you was in there, you kind of sort of trusted them because they're in the office, because they must be an employee because they got in the office, right? And if you think about the physical security that we used to have when you was in a workplace, the enterprise network and that, suddenly you don't know, you haven't got visual on the person, have you? Right? So anybody could be anybody out there. So you need to be a lot better around working out, is Ollie really Ollie? Because somebody could be pretending to be Ollie. And that's where the whole sort of zero trust thing comes in, is don't assume that the person's okay. Don't assume the device is okay. Start off from no trust, because zero trust is one of those oxymorons that people think it sounds like, oh, no one's allowed anything. No, it's about assume everybody is bad, which sounds bad as well when you say it like that, doesn't it? But assume everyone is rogue, and then build in oh, it is you. Okay, now you can go through, right? It's always verifies that kind of concept. And the challenge there has been is a lot of people couldn't do that properly. Because if I kept on asking for Ollie for his password every millisecond, he'd get quite annoyed, right? So if you're constantly you've got to have this balance, and it's sort of that speed and agility thing we just spoke about. If you keep asking for it, it's really secure, but it's going to be horrible to use. So you need to think about ways of assuming trust at certain points and almost doing it in the background so people don't get affected. And that's kind of one of the things that we've always been trying to put into the VMware solutions is get really good user experience without constantly asking them for stuff, but then still have a lot of sort of security at the back end and constantly verifying on things that they don't need to. Single sign-on to apps sounds like everybody knows about single sign-on, but doing things like that, cert-based authentication, right? In the back, there's a lot of things you can do, but you need to really think about changing not just the tech, but how you used to think about things, right? Don't trust the office anymore. I reckon when you go back to the office, make the whole network almost considered to be not a trusted network. And that's what we always done at VMware. There is no trusted network outside of data center. Everybody is considered to be a guest, if you like. There's no concept of a guest network versus a normal network. Everyone's a guest. And then when you authenticate, then we know who isn't a guest. Right? That makes sense. So, and that's kind of the things you need to think about. But for a lot of people, it's like, oh, really? Okay. That's not how I used to design it. So there's a lot of things we need to do there, but it's going to take a while. But yeah, what's happened over the last couple of, year and a half, I think has made people think they need to rethink about this stuff. Yeah.
But I think again,
combination of sorry, go on, Ollie.
No, go for it, Max. Sorry.
Just get that combination of the security, but without impacting end user experience is a big one. People think work from anywhere or work from home is more flexible, and you can have people that are more productive. But like you said, if they're spending all of their time constantly logging back into an application or setting up a VPN on their laptop constantly because you've got to make it secure, then suddenly you're not productive working from anywhere because you're just going through this constant cycle of monitoring and signing into things all the time. So it's one of those things where you certainly need the security, but that kind of seamless security to the end user where they're not really noticing it.
Yeah, completely. And you're back to the unlocking your phone with the face, right? Or purchasing an app from the App Store. And again, it's the same thing. Rupert, just out of interest, over the last decade, have you seen more and more businesses that you deal with manage mobile devices and tablets? And when I say tablets, I'm not talking about a Windows Surface device. I'm talking about other machines like iPads or Samsung tablets. Have you started to see more and more corporate?
Yeah, well, absolutely. Yeah, I mean yes, in short, it kicked off with the iPhone in the mid 2000s, and everyone got terribly excited about that. And then slowly, as Microsoft have opened up the gates to allow more and more devices to have deeper and deeper integration with the Microsoft stack, it's been asked of us, and where necessary, we've proposed full mobile device management and bring your own device solutions. But yeah, it's almost exploded to the point where everything is a mobile device to be managed, and there is little difference between an iPhone and a Surface Book 2, 2. Which is what I'm using. There's little difference. They receive the same types of policies through Intune, and they receive updates, and they can't bleed data, and they're encrypted, and blah blah blah, blah and all that stuff. And there's no difference. And so, yes. But then conversely, you get other businesses who just aren't interested in that. And you say multi-factor authentication, and they say no. All right.
I can't believe you managed to say the I word in the Microsoft stack, since I spent probably 3 years of my life competing tooth and nail inside VMware against that.
How'd that work out?
No. It worked out, pretty well. The outcome of all of that, though, is that there's basically management solutions out there that allow you to manage a device, whether it's a mobile all the way through to enterprise grade desktops, essentially, and on from there. But essentially, where we're going with this, though, is if you're the sort of business that issues a mobile phone to your employees, this is a single point of failure in terms of security, especially if it's consuming things like email and corporate documents and other data. But likewise as well, the MDM generation that started in about 2009 transitioned from just managing and locking down these devices all the way through to consuming data and making these productivity tools. What was the analogy, Spence? It was snack, lunch, and dine. Is that right? I can't remember now. I'm going back a few years. You have a different device, right?
Yeah, snack, cook, and dine. Yeah,
that's it.
Sorry, snack, dine, and cook. So snack meant phone was like occasional quick information. The kind of you wake up, look at it, right, done, 2-second jobbies, right? Dine is more, I've got a bit more time. I'm on the train. I've been on a train for a while, but you sit down for a while, Kindle, whatever, look at a bit more detail. And then cook is you normally have something with a keyboard properly that you can actually write stuff more than a paragraph. That's kind of the scenario. Yeah. So you use different form factors according to what you're trying to do. If you're consuming info, you're more likely just to look at it. Although saying that, a lot of kids that I know just like done. So what do I know? I don't need a keyboard for that, apparently. So my kids tell me so.
Ultimately, if you're an accountant and you're sending me an Excel spreadsheet to consume and ingest on a mobile phone, you are safe. That's really where I'm going with that, purely and simply because it's so difficult to do on these devices. I could use an iPad and I can use a laptop, but essentially the different formats work for different scenarios. I just think it's interesting that managing the mobile device, there was an explosion of it in 2013, 2014. It's just been a cadence ever since. But I think as well, a lot of smaller businesses haven't been thinking about it. A lot of SMBs until probably the last 5 years haven't been thinking about how do I manage those devices, but also of the applications they should be able to connect to in the data center, how do I get them to be able to log in and do all the security piece? I think essentially what I'm trying to say there now is that there's a single management plane for any device. And that's important for people to take away, that, don't just look at laptops as being a separate estate to a mobile phone. They're actually all part of the same ecosystem. And essentially, from Lee, from your perspective in the data center, and Max, from your perspective in terms of getting connectivity back there, it's all part of the same kind of portfolio, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's simplifying things, any sort of access to any device, from any device or anything, and getting these things as they build up. But it is, coming into this very nice, even keel of making things as simple as possible, really.
Yeah, having everybody on the same, making things as simple as possible for the end user is the big one. Which is why, so we deliver just resilient internet connections to somebody's house as far as they're concerned. So all of our customers are rolling out our home worker solutions. As far as their staff are concerned, their business has just paid for them to have a really good internet connection. They don't really care what it's doing behind the scenes. But behind the scenes, what that can do is things like access to the corporate network, filtering over business data if needs be, access to cloud applications if needs be. But again, it's completely seamless to the actual end user themselves. And that's one of the things that I think any work from home solution needs to be. It's just kind of melts into the background, goes unnoticed to an extent.
To that point, and just to kind of round out, it's not just corporates and it's not just businesses that have this trouble. Somebody told me this week that a pilot got on board their F-35 jet and couldn't remember their password to unlock it. True story. Unfortunately, there was no forgot your password link to send them an email for them to be able to unlock it. They had to go through MOD and prove who they were in order to get their password reset, but that's a true story. On that basis, are there any other questions for the panel while we have them here today?
Can I just ask a question? I'm a chairman of a company. We have a fairly sophisticated IT system, but we're a manufacturing company, so very few of us work from home, apart from some of the non-exec directors and chairmen and so on. But I am concerned about security of data, particularly over home networking systems and things like that. And I'm just wondering where the future lies in terms of VPN and VI and things like that, and whether, a small company like ours, which is really effectively a manufacturing company, so we only have probably about 2 or 3 people working from home at any one time, where the costs justify going for more elaborate systems.
So I can talk about what we've seen on the kind of the VPN replacement. It really depends. One of the things that we found is that businesses didn't want to rely on somebody turning on a VPN on their connection, or even just managing it. So what we're doing with our solution is essentially managing the entire internet connection. So first of all, they can work from home because it's a high quality internet connection and we are prioritizing and deprioritizing traffic over it. But what we're doing is we're replacing the VPN to an extent. We're managing that connection between whether it's the internet or a cloud application or your office. So right now it might be a VPN to access something you've got hosted on site, but in the future you might want to move something to DCI Squared, or you might want to move something to AWS and Azure, and we're going to manage that transition. Now it's going to cost more than a home broadband connection when you take into account the time taken to manage the VPN and just the hassle that comes with it. It's kind of a zero-touch internet connection where if you do have staff working from home, it kind of just manages itself to an extent. And going back to this entire topic, if you like, the idea being is that people can work from anywhere and have an office-like experience. And that's the kind of.
I think this is so important. Where we've got an office in America, for example, and things like that. So I think it's going to become more and more an issue. Yeah.
And also as well, there's ways that you can protect the data itself. So there are rights protection out there now, so that, you know, if somebody shares a Word document with a third party, it's unreadable because they haven't been granted rights to access that data. So there are a number of ways that you can essentially build a system that's secure enough to do that. You say about cost to business, and this is, you know, this has come up in my past several times. Essentially, what would be the cost of the business if you lost the data?
Absolutely, yeah. And that's the key, isn't it? It's the reputation and the loss of business and revenue. Yeah. No.
So so from that perspective, you know, there will be an investment, but the investment, this is like car insurance, isn't it? I could drive my car without car insurance, but it's probably not a good idea. It will get crushed if I get found out, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just easier to pay it and know full well that you're protected in that scenario.
Even just things like having a larger team to then support people work from home. You know, you might, instead of going for, you might have an easier IT solution, something a bit cheaper, but then you're probably going to need to hire somebody, even an IT function, to manage that VPN and the access and things anyway. So really, however you do it, there's going to have to be some kind of expense to support work from anywhere, whether it's in staff or technology, I think.
The other thing which I'm intrigued by, having been a lawyer in a previous life where we had a document management system and it was quite sophisticated, I suspect most small companies haven't really looked at housekeeping of the documents and the data they have.
Yeah, well, again, and there are solutions to do that today now, and they're in place and they're cloud ready. I know Microsoft 365 has a number of controls. I know VMware has its own file solution as well that does something very similar. So again, it's not a technology conversation. I think the key takeaway here is that businesses now are in a scenario where if they invest in the right technology, they're going to gain from the agility that should anything like this happen again, they're already set up for it. But more importantly, you've got sufficient controls in place today to allow employees to work from anywhere. So if you onboard somebody new, you know, that's part of the incentive to work for your organization. So, you know, these are the sort of things that people are addressing. Are there any more questions for the team before we close out for today's session? Cracking. On that basis, really appreciate the time today. Thank you very much for the participation, Rupert and Andrew, and for the questions. Mr. Bridge, is there anything you would like to wrap up with? It's good to have you return to the call that you started nearly 12 months ago, right?
Yeah, it's a long time ago, and as everybody has been talking about, so much has changed. But it really is critical that businesses do utilise the expertise of the people that we've got on the call today to make sure that they have a resilient system and that people can operate safely from home and protect, you know, all of the information and the systems that they've got. And you know, we're only as good as the weakest link, unfortunately. And, you know, all of us are possibly the weakest link if we're not careful. And we need to make sure that we have got systems to deal with it. So it's really great that everybody's been able to kind of go through the work that they've done and the expertise they've got. And hopefully businesses will learn for the future, because we are going to have a different way of working. And people are going to be required to access company data from different locations, and everybody needs to look at exactly how their systems need to work and how resilient they need to be. And particularly those people and companies, even like the Chamber ourselves, that have got quality systems, we have to actually show in detail how we are going to protect our business and the procedures that we've got in place to do so. So, you know, it's really, really important. But thanks everybody for being with us today, and glad I was able to join you. It's a topic that's very much almost at the foremost of my mind, to ensure that businesses know exactly what steps they need to take. And the first one is to make sure they talk to an expert, help them get it right. So thanks again. Thank you, Ollie.
Thank you, John. Thanks very much, everybody. Thank you to our panelists. The video will be circulated as always to those people that couldn't make it today as well. So thank you very much for your time, and have a good rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you
Take
very
care.
much.
Thank you.